Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to take a moment to thank Chairman Gallego for calling this important hearing, and also to my new colleague, Congresswoman Holland, who raised this issue in her campaign. In fact, she called MMIW an epidemic in her campaign, and I think she's right. So thank you, Chairman, for calling this hearing. My understanding, and if I'm mistaken, please correct me, my understanding is that victims of violence in tribal communities are often reluctant to report and share information about crimes, and that part of this is tied to the historical relationship between settlers and indigenous communities, and that this is a particularly strong barrier in rural communities. And Professor, and I want to say Chief Justice Deere, can you give us some examples of what these historical concerns are, how it plays out in present times? And I'm particularly interested in the difference between rural and urban communities.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think the historical mistrust that many Native people have in law enforcement is well-founded. I think that the history of law enforcement in Indian country has not been one of necessarily protection, but one of persecution. And when you are a Native woman and your sisters and your aunts and your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother have all been victims of violence and nobody's done anything, why would you come forward? And I think that trust has to be built, and it's not going to happen in one bill, and it's not going to happen in 1 year. That trust is going to take years and years and years to rebuild. I think the challenge in the urban environment is that Native women, particularly if, you know, she is not the perfect victim like Elizabeth Smart or Drew Shodine that get on CNN primetime. If she's had an addiction problem, or she's been homeless, or maybe her children have been taken from her, and you go to urban or off-reservation police departments, oftentimes families tell us there's just a shrug and a, well, what did you expect? And at that point, then the family is left feeling as though nobody cares. And so both on reservation and off reservation, we need to develop and cultivate a culture of compassion and a culture of understanding. And that's not something you can easily do through legislation, but I believe with the leadership of Congress, we will begin to see a sea change in that problem.
Thank you. And Representative Buffalo, you spoke about a couple of issues that I'm interested in, data and training. On data, we're interested in ways that these concerns can be overcome. What you said in your testimony, I wrote it down, without data, there is no clear evidence that a problem exists. So what can we do to improve our data collection systems? For example, you suggest in your testimony that the language of MMIW be included in the scope of work for the Office on Violence Against Women and the Office for Victims of Crime. What I'm after here is, can you give us specific examples of language that you think should be used?
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright and members of the committee. It's unfortunate that we have to have the ask to include the language of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and people. So it's, I will say that first and foremost. But also, you know, our efforts on the ground level, at the grassroots level, are grassroots and for prevention. How can we prevent these tragedies from further occurring? But we do have to address the existing structures and what systems are currently in place. So we do need to include, we believe, this language of missing and murdered Indigenous people. At the state level, what we found in digging deeper into the data collection statewide is that North Dakota does not currently collect any data on missing people. Right. So that was...
Well, we'll talk further about the language.
Okay.
And I thank you for the suggestions. I also understand you proposed legislation to conduct conduct training for law enforcement in your legislature. What are some of the topics that you think this training should focus on?
So, Mr. Cartwright and members of the committee, at the state level with the training, we are tapping into existing structures such as the North Dakota Human Trafficking Commission. So that commission is comprised of different experts in the field. So this legislation is giving that body the freedom to provide that training to law enforcement. Within that commission, the Human Trafficking Commission, there's members of the First Nations Women's Alliance who have established and built relationships throughout North Dakota and the region. So some of this training would look at perhaps cultural competency training, understanding the differences within tribes, some that are matriarchal, and just understanding, also trying to find ways to build trust and to work towards healing and justice in our communities.
Thank you so much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.